In the Arizona desert, a detective needs to link a murderer to a crime scene. The only witnesses are two bean pods. A grotesque murder on a quiet beach has police baffled. A forensic geologist hopes to transform a spoonful of sand into a witness for the prosecution. After years of hunting for a clandestine grave, the only thing binding a killer to his victim is a tree root. In the past, rural landscapes have offered safe haven to murderers hoping to keep their crimes concealed. Now, thanks to the burgeoning fields of forensic botany and geology, the killer who puts his faith in nature's silence sows his own seeds of destruction. The Sonoran Desert. How many lives have been brutally ended in desolate landscapes like this one, with only an audience of trees to bear witness? Today, those unlikely observers are gaining a voice with which to expose the guilty. The Caterpillar Proving Grounds outside of Phoenix, Arizona, was a thrilling diversion for a man heading home one Sunday in May 1992. Cutting through a dry wash, he was struck by something out of place in the raw landscape. He moved in for a closer look. Face down, beneath a canopy of Palo Verde trees, lay the nude body of a woman. She wasn't breathing. Officers from the Maricopa County Sheriff's Department arrived at the scene. From the condition of the body, it appeared the victim had been murdered within the last 12 hours. Her clothing was scattered nearby. Braided wire and shoelaces were wrapped around her wrists and ankles. It seemed the killer had spent some time with the victim before leaving her here. Detective Charlie Norton led the investigation. The victim was identified by her fingerprints as 30-year-old Denise Johnson. She'd been arrested for prostitution. Hours passed as the team pored over the crime scene. They hoped to weave tatters of evidence into the coherent narrative of a homicide.
She had a white t-shirt, just an undershirt, was wrapped around her neck, and it looked like maybe she had been strangled.
As the team examined the torn clothes for clues, a fundamental piece of the puzzle came like a plea from beyond the grave. The insistent beeping from a pager broke the silence of the desert. Was some friend, unaware of Johnson's fate, trying to reach her? Or was this the forgotten property of a careless killer? A court order was obtained and the pager company contacted. The owner of the pager was traced through its ID number.
The pager subscriber was a fellow by the name of Earl Bogan, and he said that his son Mark had exclusive use of the pager because he didn't have any telephone communication, and basically that was the only way that the family had to get in touch with Mark.
While police processed the crime scene, a man came forward with a statement. At 1:30 the previous morning, he'd noticed something odd, a white pickup truck with amber clearance lights. whipping out of the proving grounds. The driver ran a stop sign, then flew toward the interstate. Combined with the pager information, this eyewitness testimony would give Norton a leg up on the investigation. When Norton learned that Mark Bogan owned a white pickup truck with amber clearance lights, it seemed to him he found the killer. He would now have to prove it. Bogan, accompanied by his wife Rebecca, agreed to be interviewed at the sheriff's department.
We'll talk to her and we'll talk to him.
In an interview with police, recreated here, Rebecca said that on the night of the murder, Mark came home at 2 a.m., his face bloodied and scratched. He told Rebecca he'd been in a bar brawl. But Bogan told police a different story. He claimed he'd picked up a hitchhiker who fit Denise Johnson's description and had sex with her in his truck. Bogan admitted lying to his wife because he knew she'd be disgusted with the truth. The story was coming together a bit too neatly for Norton, and he wondered whether Bogan was twisting the facts to fit the evidence.
And I think somebody made contact with him and told him that the sheriff's office investigators were looking for him. So I think that kind of basically tipped him off, and he came up with this story.
According to Bogan, after their encounter, he and the hitchhiker argued. He ordered her out of the truck, and as she left, she swiped his wallet and pager. Bogan chased her and fought to recover the wallet. He claimed to have left Johnson on the side of the interstate, alive. Norton suspected that Bogan was telling only half the story.
I suspect probably that what Mark told me when I interviewed him, as far as picking her up, having an argument and so forth like that, I suspect all that's probably true. But the part that he left out is where it happened and that he ended up killing her.
Norton believed that Bogan was a murderer, but he wasn't getting any help from the suspect. Not only did Bogan adamantly deny killing Denise Johnson, it had been years, he claimed, since he'd even stepped foot in the Caterpillar proving grounds. Bogan's admission that he had spent the evening with Denise Johnson would, ironically, make it more difficult to prove that he had killed her.
We got nothing on this guy. Everything that he's told us shuts down all of our whole case. He had sex with her, he knows who she is, the whole shooting match.
Bogan's story, spotty as it was, had just defused an arsenal of forensic weaponry. DNA analysis of body fluids or fingernail scrapings could only prove something which Bogan had already admitted. On the evening of May 2nd, 1992, he and Denise Johnson had sex, then fought. Norton's only hope of bringing Bogan to justice would be to link him to the scene of the crime, a little patch of grass under a cluster of Palo Verde trees in the proving grounds. Bogan's truck was seized and searched, but nothing linking Bogan to Johnson's death was found. 2 seemingly unexceptional Palo Verde seed pods were collected from the truck bed. But thousands of these trees grow in southern Arizona. The pods could have come from anywhere. It hardly seemed like the kind of evidence that could tie a man to a murder. Struggling for a way to link Bogan to the crime scene, Detective Norton returned to the proving grounds. Then, inspiration struck. Noticing a Palo Verde tree with a fresh scrape on it, he theorized that after dumping Johnson's body, Bogan's truck had brushed this tree, causing the pods to flutter free and land in his truck bed. If DNA testing could prove that the pods in Bogan's truck matched the scarred tree, Norton and his colleagues would be able to dismantle Bogan's alibi. But there was a problem. The test they envisioned had never been done before. To catch a killer, Detective Norton approached Timothy Helenjaris, Associate Professor of Molecular Genetics at the University of Arizona. Norton wanted to determine whether there was enough variability in Palo Verde DNA to distinguish one tree from another.
When I was contacted by the Sheriff's Department, they told me that they had some pods that were collected from the truck, and they thought they might have matched one of the trees at the site. They did remark that one of the trees had scrape marks, and so they had one particular tree in mind. So I asked them to collect pods from all the trees around the sites, but not to tell me which one was marked, and just to number them so it would be a blind study.
Using a cutting-edge technique called rapids for randomly amplified polymorphic DNA, Helenjaris rendered genetic profiles of sample trees and pods. The results were surprising. Palo Verde DNA appeared to be as complex as the human code. It seemed that individual trees could be easily distinguished from one another. Dr. Helenjaris first confirmed that the pods from Bogan's truck were from the same tree. He then compared that profile with DNA profiles from a lineup of 11 trees at the crime scene.
When we then informed the Sheriff's Department of which numbered tree it was, it turned out to be the one that in fact had the scrape marks on it that they were suspicious of to start with. So we felt pretty confident with our result there.
The noose was tightening around Mark Bogan's neck. He was arrested and a court date set. Armed with Helenjaris' findings, the prosecution was eager to confront the defendant with the silent testimony of a Palo Verde tree. But Bogan wasn't going down without a fight. To convict Mark Bogan of killing Denise Johnson, the prosecution hung their case on the admissibility of rapids, a legally unproven procedure. DNA analysis of humans had only been deemed admissible in Arizona courts a few months earlier. Using plant DNA to prove murder would be a stretch, and yet the entire case hinged on it. Bogan's defense team hired its own expert, Paul Keim of Northern Arizona University, to refute Helenjaris' findings in a pretrial hearing. If Keim could cast doubt on the validity of Helenjaris' technique, Bogan would likely walk out of court a free man.
So I think that the Bogan family hoped that my expert advice, expert opinion on the new DNA fingerprinting method that was being employed here would say that this was not a valid approach to forensic science, and that this was not conclusive evidence that their son had been at the crime scene. Hey, Jim,
though he was brought into the case as a hired gun for the defense, Dr. Keim's loyalty was to science and the responsible use of laboratory testing. His mistrust about rapids was valid. Since its debut, the new technique had been known to give false readings if the extremely careful controls aren't maintained throughout testing.
In my opinion, it meant that we had to hold it up to a very high standard of scrutiny, and so that it was important that we understood everything that was done here and that it was done correctly.
When performed with extreme care, Rapids provides researchers with an amazing new tool: the ability to look at an organism's DNA without any prior information about that species' genetic composition. The first step in the process is to get the DNA out of the pods. The seeds must be removed for accurate testing. Each represents a mixture of the tree's genetic material with the pollen that fertilized it, and would therefore introduce separate DNA into the test. Liquid nitrogen instantly freezes the pod so that it can be easily pulverized. Once it has been purified, the DNA is ready for PCR gene amplification. This heating process increases a minute sample of DNA, to provide technicians with ample genetic material for testing. When reconstituted with water, the seed pod's DNA will be invisible to the eye, but extremely revealing in other ways. The Palo Verde sample is now ready to yield its genetic fingerprint. In order to make that pattern visible, a process called gel electrophoresis is used. Blue dye is added to the DNA sample, which is then inserted into the lanes on a jello-like slab. Exposure to an electrical field causes the fragments in the DNA to separate. The resulting barcode is then illuminated with UV light and photographed. When hired by Bogan's defense team, Keim had been skeptical about Rapid's ability to conclusively differentiate between Palo Verde trees. But when he studied Dr. Helenjaris's data and the painstaking process by which he collected it, he was surprised at how definitive the results were. Influenced by his colleagues' findings, Keim was won over to the prosecution's side, and under oath, he couldn't refute the results. In Keim's opinion, the tree and the pod matched to a great degree of certainty. The defense team now faced an insurmountable setback by the researchers' fidelity to science. Bogan was going down.
When I examined the scientific evidence, the first thing that was most obvious to me is that the DNA from the pod that was found in Bogan's truck did in fact have exactly the same DNA fingerprint pattern as one of the trees where the body was found.
Helenjaris and Keim had placed Mark Bogan at the crime scene. After he had killed Denise Johnson, Bogan backed his truck into a tree and shook loose the evidence that would later convict him. The unrefuted genetic findings decimated the foundation of Bogan's defense. Bogan was convicted of murder and sent to prison for life. Helenjaris's trailblazing research established botanical DNA profiling as an effective forensic tool, giving a voice to two tiny seed pods, without whose testimony a murderer would still be walking among us. A world away from the Arizona desert, New England's coastline can be as desolate a place to die as the barren Sonora landscape. But like those seemingly inconsequential Palo Verde pods, grains of sand can be made to talk. On the morning of June 30th, 1994, a woman and her two nephews roamed Crescent Beach in Rhode Island. Buried treasure was the children's goal. What they found instead seemed to have been buried alive. Detective Arthur Clark of the East Providence Police Department was called to investigate the buried woman at the beach. The scene was more reminiscent of a Stephen King novel than anything the veteran detective had seen in person. 2 feet beneath the surface lay a woman in a red satin cocktail dress. Her life had been ended by multiple blows to the head.
We arrived on the scene about 10:15. We verified they were human arms. It appeared a body was buried in a shallow grave. We notified the medical examiner's office, who responded.
The victim's arms jutted out from beneath the sand, her hands clawing skyward in what seemed a final grasp for life. It seemed unlikely that she'd been buried alive. The medical examiner concluded that in her condition, the victim wouldn't have the strength to push her hands up through the sand. Someone had posed her into this final gesture like a scene from a horror film. The killer seemed to be leaving a calling card, but his message was inscrutable. A circular pattern had been pressed into the sand around the body. In it lay a shattered watch face, its hands frozen at midnight. But for detectives, time raced forward. It seemed that some sort of grotesque ritual was performed here. They feared it could be the beginning of killings to come. They needed to work quickly before this killer struck again. At this early stage of investigation, vital clues might be masquerading as common trash. Cigarette butts, candy wrappers, and plastic cups were collected from the scene, along with samples of sand from both the surface and the bottom of the grave.
At the time, we didn't know what was evidence and what was not. So on the side of caution, we collected what we thought could end up being evidence.
Once we put the tape out, there's been nobody else in the area.
But before Clark could make sense of the eerie spectacle, he'd have to learn more about the victim. He didn't have to look far.
At around 8 o'clock that evening, a gentleman by the name of Christopher Hutter, who lived in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, called the Pawtucket police to report his wife missing.
The missing woman was 30-year-old Kendra Hutter. From a photograph, Clark recognized her as the murder victim. According to her husband, Kendra and he had lived more like roommates than lovers. Beyond the facade of domestic contentment dwelt a loveless marriage, bound together by financial need and parental obligation. They agreed to date other people. Christopher Hutter told police that Kendra had a date the night she died. Police later learned she met him through a personal ad. The divorced white male described himself as a cheerful, attractive father. Hoping to add a dash of romance to her life, she contacted him and they arranged for a date. On the night of June 29th, Kendra scribbled the man's name and phone number for her husband. The card read, Gary. Detective Clark identified Gary as Gary Tassone, a truck driver who lived with his mother and brother in Cumberland. He told police that he'd had 3 dates with Kendra Hutter, but denied having been with her on the night of her murder. The personable Tassone did his best to help Clark, telling police that he knew Kendra and her husband were having marital trouble. He suggested that perhaps the disgruntled Christopher Hutter was the murderer. When Tassone told Clark he'd been to the beach where the body was found, Clark asked him to come to the station to continue questioning.
After taking his first statement, there were several things that didn't jive. There were some inconsistencies in what he told us and what we had learned up until then.
In an interview with police, recreated here, Tassone adamantly denied having been with Kendra Hutter the night of the murder. As the interview wore on, however, he revised his story. He admitted he'd been on a date with her that night, but dropped her off around 11 o'clock. But that contradicted what Kendra's husband reported. According to him, Kendra never made it home that night. As far as they could tell, Tassone was the last person to see the victim alive. The detectives pressed on.
Detective Bilodeau and I spoke to him on and off for about 4 hours that evening. He never displayed any signs of emotion. He spoke very well. He was articulate, polite, cool, calm. He was not nervous at all. Pretty just matter of fact.
Clark continued to question Tassone, and as the interview moved into its 5th grueling hour, Tassone finally offered up an account. He and Kendra had been building sand castles when a noise startled him, causing him to inadvertently strike her in the head. In a panic, he buried the body in the sand. Considering the extent of Kendra Hutter's injuries, 7 strikes to the head, Clark rejected the story. There was no question in the detective's mind that the victim was killed intentionally.
What is it? What's wrong?
We don't know why she was murdered, but it was no accident.
On the surface, it seemed that Tassone was beginning to cooperate, but his statement made no sense, and Clark didn't know what to make of it. The tale he told of accidental death was far-fetched and implausible, but probably reflected a skewed version of what really happened. From what Clark had already learned of the case, Tassone was sprinkling his narrative with blatant lies. The resulting story was more confusion than confession. If only Clark could sift through the fantasy and get to the truth, he'd have the case sewn up. For now, Clark had to follow along and see where Tassone would take him. Under the guise of cooperation, the suspect led police to a roadside embankment where he said he ditched the shovel. It seemed like just another delay tactic, but a shovel did indeed turn up. With this discovery, the evidence seemed to be stacked on Clark's side. He had a murder victim buried in a ritualistic fashion. He had the alleged murder weapon. He had a suspect who could link the two together. But Clark only had Tassone's unlikely story to place him at the crime scene. To make the charges stick, he needed to construct a more coherent account of what happened. Armed with a warrant, police searched Tassone's car. The findings were slim, amounting to little more than a scattering of sand. It seemed Clark had found all the evidence there was to find. It was time to go to court. But at the start of the criminal trial in January of 1997, Tassone began to backpedal. Claiming to have been coerced into confession in exchange for immunity, Tassone recanted his story and explained away the sand in his trunk as having come from an evening with another woman at the beach. The shovel, he said, was just a shovel. Police couldn't disprove it. Suddenly, Detective Clark found the tide was turning against him. Without Gary Tassone's confession, Detective Clark and the Rhode Island police had to treat the case as if they'd never had a confession at all. To link Tassone to the crime scene, Clark needed solid evidence, but all he had was a handful of sand. Clark knew the answer was written here, but he wasn't able to read it. To build a case on such unusual evidence was beyond the resources of his small department. He had to call in the experts. He sent the physical evidence to the FBI's Forensic Geology Lab, the only one of its kind in the country. There, geologist Bruce Hall examined the shovel, the blanket, debris from the crime scene, and the sand recovered from Tassone's vehicle.
The contributor, East Providence, Rhode Island, asked that we compare any soil or sand recovered from any of those items with some known samples of sand that they had recovered from the crime scene. In this situation, it was a beach.
To see the past in a grain of sand, that is Hall's mission. Each grain is a world unto itself, differing not only across continents, but across the length and breadth of a shoreline as well. Every child knows that sand on the surface of a beach is different from sand below. But what few criminals realize is that these differences can be measured and compared.
We have known soil samples from the grave. We have some, because it is a grave, we're dealing in 3 dimensions. We have some that were taken a number of different locations on the surface of the earth. As now we have a profile, if you will. We've got a hole in the ground that may be 1, 2, 3 foot deep. We have a number of samples now from various depths.
If the grains of sand found in the suspect's car came from the bottom of the excavated grave rather than the beach surface, as Tassone claimed, Hall would soon find out. To catch Tesson, Hall concentrated on the sand samples taken from the bottom of the victim's grave. If sand on any of Tesson's possessions matched it, Clark would have his case. Geologic examination takes a three-pronged approach. Samples are compared according to color, texture, and composition. The analysis begins with a careful look at color. This first test requires no sophisticated equipment, but it's essential for ruling out samples that would have no bearing on Tesson's case.
We view these under a number of different lighting conditions, daylight, again, fluorescent light, incandescent light, and compare their color. This soil representing soil recovered from the shovel, dissimilar to that collected from the beach. The blanket, again, at arm's length, we can see there's a color difference. This soil did not originate from the same source as the known soil. However, when we take a look at the soil from a vehicle, they're strikingly similar with respect to color.
The color comparison demonstrated that, judging from the sand grain evidence, the shovel may not have been involved in the crime. Or Tesson may have used it elsewhere before ditching it. It seemed like just another red herring Tesson threw out to get police off his scent. Tesson won that battle, but not the war. The sand from his car matched the color of the sand collected from the bottom of the grave. Hall moved on to phase 2 with this sample, analyzing texture. The sand is rinsed with water and exposed to ultrasonic waves, which vibrate off any silt or clay clinging to the sample. The sample is dried and placed under a stereo microscope. Now, Hall looks at the size and texture of the grains. A well-sorted sample consists of same-sized grains, like table salt, whereas a poorly sorted sample contains a variety of sizes, like a can of mixed nuts. Hall also looks at the shapes of the individual grains. Are they round, angular, or oval, for example? In the sand from Tesson's car, the grains were mixed consistently. The sample was said to be well sorted and made up of well-rounded grains. So was the sample taken from the bottom of the grave. The walls were closing in on Gary Tesson, but Hall still had one more test to perform. He examined the soil samples under a polarized light microscope to determine their mineral composition. Different minerals have different optical properties when exposed to polarized light. These characteristics enable Hall to identify them.
Characterizing minerals is fundamentally no different than characterizing an individual. How tall is that individual? How much do they weigh? What is their hair color, eye color? And you characterize a mineral in the same fashion.
The sample from Tesson's trunk was composed predominantly of quartz, with a small amount of the mineral feldspar. When he looked at the sand from the bottom of Kendra Hutter's grave under the same conditions, he found the samples matched. Bruce Hall had now proven that Gary Tesson was in fact with Kendra Hutter on the beach the night she died. And more than that, he proved that Tesson buried her body. Based largely on the strength of Bruce Hall's forensic evidence, the jury found Gary Tesson guilty of first-degree murder. He is serving a life sentence without parole. The strange man had lured a woman from the personal ads, beaten her in the head with a shovel almost 20 times, and buried her in a way sure to be noticed. The motive and meaning of his crime remain a mystery. Also unknown is whether this was the first strike of Gary Tesson. As he drove his truck across the country, did he place ads in other papers, luring unsuspecting women like Kendra Hutter to their deaths? Or was his first victim also his last? Though the grave markers may be erased by time, nature doesn't forget death. The world is forever changed for the family of a murder victim. The same holds true for the landscape in which a body is buried. 20-year-old Cher Elder was known around the Denver suburb of Lakewood, Colorado, as having a mind of her own. It didn't make for smooth relationships. On the evening of March 27, 1993, she had a skirmish with her boyfriend, Byron Powers. No doubt apologies follow after a few hours of downtime. To blow off some steam, Cher caught a ride to Central City, a seedy gambling town 1 hour's drive into the Rockies. Her escort, an older man, was good company, and her moodiness lifted as the night wore on. At 1:40 the next morning, Cher and her companion left the casino. She would soon join the ranks of the missing. Days passed with no sign of Cher. Her frantic father reported her missing to the Lakewood Police Department. Detective Scott Richardson was assigned to the case. Missing person cases are a tricky call. Richardson didn't want to throw his department's resources behind a massive search, only to find that the time and energy had been misspent on a girl who'd left town to cool off.
It's a tough investigation. How involved do you want to get on a missing person case, and how complex do you want to make a missing person case to find out they're laying out on the beach in Maui somewhere?
Richardson had a bad feeling, however, that Cher wasn't on vacation. His first objective was to identify the man with whom she'd last been seen. A surveillance camera at the casino had captured his image.
We did not know who that male was, and that was the last time she was seen alive. A friend of hers had seen her in the casino with this male.
The man was identified as Thomas Luther, an acquaintance of Cher's boyfriend, Byron Powers. Cher had been introduced to the older man shortly before her unlucky gambling trip to Central City. The more he learned about Thomas Luther, the more Richardson sensed that he was no longer looking for a missing person. He was now looking for a body. In Thomas Luther, Cher had picked the wrong shoulder to cry on. A known sex offender, Luther was fresh off a 10-year prison sentence for attacking and raping a young woman. He had bragged in jail that when he got out, the police wouldn't find the next woman he killed. This time, he'd be sure to bury the body where it would never be found. Richardson set out to foil that plan.
Our focus of the case at that time was to try to find the body of Cher Elder for two reasons. We needed it for prosecution and the family.
Richardson questioned Luther, who claimed that after leaving the casino, he dropped Elder off at her boyfriend's house. Luther's car was seized and searched for evidence, but nothing suggesting murder was found. For weeks, Richardson pressed on. Though he had very little hard evidence, knowing that this girl's body was out there somewhere kept the detective searching. To outsmart a clever criminal like Luther, Richardson would need to raise the suspect's level of uneasiness, hopefully compelling him back to the gravesite for a cautious once-over.
The prior day, I called Luther up at home and intentionally meant to sound really confident. I told him, hey, we got some evidence and I want you here at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, hoping that it would increase his anxiety and he would make a mistake.
Richardson succeeded in flushing his quarry out of the brush. An informant told him that Luther planned to return to the grave early the following morning. If the body had been dug up, he planned to flee the state immediately. Meanwhile, undercover officers cast a wide net over the metropolitan Denver area, tailing Luther's acquaintances and scouting major roads. The morning of his meeting with Richardson, police observed a man in a car parked beside the road. Soon, police saw Luther emerge from the woods and get into the car. He proceeded to his meeting with Richardson, cocky with the knowledge that his pursuer was bluffing. Without a body, Richardson couldn't hold Luther. He was bound by law to release him and his car. Months passed without any progress on the case. Meantime, the prime suspect moved out of state. With each passing day, the more likely it seemed that Cher Elder's demise would forever remain a secret between the killer and the victim. The only thing keeping Richardson going was the faith that Cher Elder was buried somewhere in Empire Valley. But finding her in the craggy lowland would be an arduous task.
This valley is about 15 miles in length. And as you get out there, when you start looking for a possible location of the grave, it's nothing but rock slides and piles of rocks. And there's so many potential areas that a body could be hidden in that it just became a maze.
Weeks of foraging around Empire Valley left detectives empty-handed and frustrated. Finding Cher Elder's body in this rough terrain required a kind of expertise that would tax the resources of almost any police department.
Was that any good? Yes. Hopefully we would.
Aware that he'd reached his department's limits, Detective Richardson was running out of options. But he wasn't quite ready to throw in the towel. The relentless detective had one final inspiration. He contacted Necro Search, an elite corps of scientists that uses a wide range of disciplines to locate clandestine graves.
Necro Search exists because a group of law enforcement officers and scientists got together and figured there had to be a better way to find murdered or buried people and evidence.
Towards that goal, Necro Search has assembled leading scientists from all over Colorado, comprising 15 specialties, including botany, geology, geophysics, forensic anthropology, and entomology.
53972.
The fundamental premise of Necro Search is that buried bodies change the ecosystem around them forever. The soil above a grave may sag under rain or snow. Specific vegetation may flourish on the decomposing body.
53969.
Insects and scavengers arrive.
This is a case of a lifetime. This took everything that we had, everything that we could use of other sources from other agencies. That's why Necro Search was requested to come in and assist. It was real simple. We're a largely populated community here. We're in the Metro Denver area. We don't have expertise in going out looking for graves. We don't have very many graves dug in the city.
So far, the all-volunteer Necro Search team has participated in over 100 cases in 30 states and 7 countries. The group convenes monthly to review potential cases. For most petitioners, like Detective Richardson, Necro Search represents a final glimmer of hope.
I was asked by Necro Search to come to their meeting and present the case to see if it was something that Necro Search could assist me in. And so the case presentation was made to Necro Search at that time. And boy, they asked me questions that I'd never thought of, such as what color was the dirt on Luther's pants when he came to get his car, because that may indicate he crawled out of a mine shaft or he may have been in a sand pit. And it was pretty apparent right then that when I contacted Necro Search, these are the people that can help me because they have the experience in trying to locate a grave.
The rocky terrain hampered the endeavor, making disturbances in the soil difficult to spot. The team probed the earth for clues undetectable to the human eye.
On the geology side, we're looking for disturbances in the layering.
and everything is layered. You wouldn't think so, but you come out here, you dig down a few feet, you'll find various layers within the rock, or within the soil, and we're looking to see where that's been disturbed.
Ground sweeps, aerial searches, and infrared analysis ruled out many potential grave sites. But still, as the months passed, no body was found. It seemed like Thomas Luther's boast about outsmarting police was coming true. In late January of 1995, a tip led Detective Richardson and Necro Search to a steep, piney slope off the highway. Rocks covered most of the area. A grave could be disguised anywhere. Necro Search did some preliminary testing of the location, but were shut down because of weather. It was now nearly 2 years after Cher's disappearance.
You don't like me and I don't like you, and that ain't no...
Then a crucial break came. Byron Powers, Cher's boyfriend, landed in prison for assault. It seemed Cher had a fatal lapse of judgment in her choice of companions. In an effort to lessen the charges against him, Powers dangled a piece of information in front of the police. He said he knew that Luther had killed Cher Elder, and he knew where he'd buried her body. Powers had been there about 3 weeks after Cher's death to help Luther better conceal the grave. Powers directed Richardson right past the point where the Necro Search team had given up. Unlike most killers who hastily dump bodies downhill, Luther had taken his time in selecting a grave that would seem an improbable choice to police.
What we ultimately learned is that Thomas Luther carried the body of Cher Elder straight up a hillside by a rock slide and went uphill, which is uncommon.
The pile of rocks that Powers pointed out was less than a foot from the place that Richardson and Necro Search had been testing shortly before the weather had forced them to quit.
We were 2 inches from the body of Cher Elder when we quit digging the first time. We went back, excavated to remove the body of Cher Elder.
As if setting up an archaeological excavation, the team established a grid and embarked upon an old-style dig. Laboriously, the team scraped soil 10 centimeters at a time. Archaeologist Steve Ireland was part of the search for Cher Elder's remains.
There, the initial 2 or 3 inches of ground was frozen. It was, January or February, as I recall. And so there we had to use a pick in order to get that top couple of inches, which was frozen off.
After 4 days and 2 feet of digging, the team reached bone. Excavated with fine hand tools like whisk brooms, toothbrushes, and bamboo sticks, the remains of a body finally took shape in the frozen soil. Dental records would identify the body as Cher Elder. Preliminary autopsy results showed that the young woman had been shot in the head 3 times, execution style. This discovery might have been enough evidence to convince a jury that Luther had killed Elder. But prosecutors would have a much better chance if they knew the time of death. If the body had been buried at least 2 years ago, a time when Cher was known to have been with Luther, the charge of murder would be much easier to prove in court. The team's careful excavation uncovered a clump of plant roots growing into the victim's soft flesh. Necro Search called in botanist Vicki Trammell to extract and preserve them. Could she determine the time of burial from this botanical evidence?
When digging is done and roots are cut, this stimulates growth of new roots into the fresh backfill dirt. So the idea was that these roots ought to be about the same general age as the grave.
In order to determine the age of the new growth, the roots were sent to a lab where they were cut crosswise and stained, highlighting the characteristics of the cells. Most woody species of trees, like the pines and firs that forested the area near the victim's grave, form their roots in the same way, and the new roots have a particular pattern of cells that can be recognized under the microscope. Most of the differences involve the xylem, which is the water-conducting tissue in the plant.
And what I'm seeing is the water-conducting tissue kind of in a triangle. And it's the triangle shape that tells me that that is a very young root, about a first-year root.
Another year's growth sees a significant change in the cells. The triangle of tissue gives way to larger water-conducting cells.
This tells me it's a secondary root.
From their cellular structure, Trammell estimated the roots to be 2 years old. Her findings sealed the case against Thomas Luther, proving the grave was dug at a time after he was released from jail and known to be with the victim. In the end, a jury was convinced that Thomas Luther killed Cher Elder. He was sentenced to 48 years in prison with no chance of parole. Thanks to the tireless pursuit of Scott Richardson and the cutting-edge forensics of the Necro search team, the odyssey had finally come to an end.
I myself don't believe in what they call closure. I believe if you lose a loved one, that you will feel that loss for the rest of your life. But at least if they know what happened, they possibly can get on with their life in some way.
After the case ended, NecroSearch paid Detective Richardson the ultimate honor and inducted him into their selective ranks. Without his determination, Cher Elder would still be hidden in a desolate grave. The Earth is an impartial eyewitness to murder. But forensic botany and geology are finding ways to gather its testimony. Crimes considered unsolvable a few years earlier are now being won on the basis of roots, seeds, and sand. The landscape has become grounds for conviction, but we've only begun to scratch the surface. Investigators in Canada are on the trail of a killer. The key lies in the victim's cells. But has fire destroyed all the evidence? At a murder scene, a handful of cigarettes provides the only clue. Will forensic detectives be able to unlock their secret? This young man was imprisoned for a rape he swears he didn't commit. Can science prove he's innocent? When police are stumped, they may turn to detectives in lab coats to uncover clues hidden inside the human cell. One strand of DNA can finger a killer or set the innocent free. The new shape of crime detection is a double helix. In July 1991, a janitor in Vancouver, British Columbia made a routine trip to the dumpster. But what he found was far from routine. Inside lay a body burned so completely he wasn't sure it was human. He ran to call police. Across town, detectives Al Catley and Rick Crook responded to the call. The homicide investigators had done this drill before. What may look like a human body sometimes turns out to be a practical joke, a discarded mannequin, or some other case of mistaken identity. They hoped that was all it was. Still, they had to check it out.
So when we walked over to take a look at inside the dumpster, there was just the outline of a human body. And in fact, it was so badly destroyed by the fire that it was questionable as to whether it was human, or we've had some instances of bear carcasses being destroyed after illegal hunting or something like that. And we didn't rule out that possibility.
You can't.
No.
The thing is, though,
The officers approached the dumpster carefully, making note of details that could become important later. The dumpster was cool to the touch when they arrived. The fire had been out for hours. A stain spread from the corner onto the pavement. Whoever set the blaze used more than enough flammable liquid to destroy the contents. A close inspection of the contents confirmed that this was no false alarm. There, amid the ashes of computer boxes, wooden flats, and scrap paper, lay a human body. After the detectives made their notes, the delicate removal of the fragile evidence began. It was gently placed in a body bag so as not to damage it any further. Then it went to the morgue, where a pathologist would examine the body for clues to its identity. Anything else that survived the blaze was also collected and sealed.
not surprising. No.
Surveying the scene, the detectives realized the murderer selected his site carefully. An industrial park closed for the weekend, surrounded by brush and trees.
In fact, we did establish that people were driving by roughly the time that we think that the homicide occurred, or the burning occurred, and there wasn't anything. You could have quite easily have driven up here and probably out without really seeing what you would have thought was a fire.
Homicides are often solved in the first 24 hours when investigators follow hot leads. But in this case, the fire had gone out. The trail had grown cold. If the murder happened just 5 years earlier, Crook and Catley would have relied solely on hunches and their talent for bulldogging a case until they had the answers. But by 1991, when this victim died, Crook and Catley knew they had an ally in the lab. A powerful new tool had been added to crime solving: DNA profiling. Investigators no longer needed a shred of evidence to solve a case. They only needed a single cell. As personal as the whorls and lines of a fingerprint, but far more difficult to hide, DNA is the next wave in scientific sleuthing. Today, scientists can extract DNA on a sweat-stained hat left by a nervous killer, from saliva on the stamp of an extortionist's letter, or from dried blood or skin scraped from underneath a victim's fingernails. Microscopic evidence has always been left behind by criminals. Only with the advent of DNA profiling has it become incriminating. DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, contains every detail that makes you human.
Back to where it was.
No two people, except identical twins, share the same patterns. DNA is small enough to fit inside the nucleus of every cell. Its shape is a double helix, like a spiral staircase wrapped around a column. Uncoiled, the double helix would stretch to 8 feet. About 99.5% of everyone's DNA is the same, but some sections vary greatly from person to person. By studying those sections, scientists can identify victims and unmask murderers. In the Virginia Division of Forensic Science in Richmond, Paul Ferrara runs one of the most progressive DNA testing labs in the country.
with the sensitivity of this technology, I don't know that I could go in and commit a violent crime and just not somehow leave something of me behind. And that's all it takes with this technology, just some little piece of me that's got a cell with a nucleus in it, and I'm in deep trouble.
Heat is the enemy of DNA, and fire is the bane of forensic investigators who try to recover DNA from torched crime scenes. A week after the victim was found, Crook and firefighters recreated the inferno to see if it could shed some light on the crime. Whether by design or accident, the killer left one lid open, creating a downdraft inside the dumpster. The rushing air whipped the flames into a frenzy. The surrounding trees hid what little smoke the fire produced. It burned at about 2,000 degrees for 30 to 40 minutes. By comparison, a crematorium burns between 1,000 to 1,400 degrees for about 3 hours. Police were lucky to have any remains at all. Now they had to figure out who was killed here. All the pathologist could tell them was that the victim was a white female. Traditional methods at a standstill, detectives focused on X-rays. They showed the victim was shot in the head, but they also revealed a feature detectives hoped would identify her. David Sweet, a forensic odontologist or dental investigator, worked on the case. Teeth are the hardest substance in the human body and the most difficult to destroy. When bodies can't be easily identified, odontologists look to the teeth to tell them about the victim. Their wear and condition can hold the story of a person's life, whether they were right or left-handed, drank water with fluoride as a child, or wore braces. By studying the victim's teeth, it was determined that she was in her early 20s. She had one extraordinary feature.
But the other thing that we realized when we examined the teeth was there was an extra tooth right in the center of the upper jaw between the upper central incisors. And those showed up very well in the x-rays that were taken after the victim died.
Crook ran a computer search that compared his findings with dental records of missing persons. None matched. Despite his best efforts, Crook was stymied. He still had a victim without a name and a murder without a suspect. Meanwhile, somewhere out there, a killer ran free, confident nothing could link him to his crime. What he didn't know was that a small piece of evidence could provide the missing link.
Looks great.
For 2 days, Detective Al Catley chased a ghost. Who was the woman in the dumpster? What awful chain of events led to her murder? Surely by now someone, a friend, a lover, a co-worker, was missing her. Catley asked his staff for missing persons reports. One stood out. Lynn Breeden, age 30. Her roommate filed the report. He had dropped her off at a friend's house. The friend saw her leaving a nightclub around 3 a.m. the night before the burned woman was found. She left with an unknown man. 3 days later, a woman posing as Lynn Breeden tried to empty her bank account. The woman presented a withdrawal slip with Breeden's account number.
Hi, I need to make a withdrawal.
Okay.
The teller knew she wasn't who she claimed to be. When she questioned the imposter, the woman became flustered. When the teller tried to detain the woman, she hurried out.
No, I need you to stay here.
Wait, I gotta go.
No, I need you to stay here.
A security camera captured the failed transaction. Analysis of the film revealed a man waiting for the woman in the parking lot. Police made a photo of the woman from the tape and ran it in the newspaper. She was identified and called in for questioning. She told police a friend had offered her $500 to scam the bank. She knew nothing of the murder. The friend was Chris Cruz, an exotic dancer who used the stage name Tony Devons. Detectives placed him under constant surveillance, then asked him to come in to speak with police. Not realizing police were watching him, Cruz parked his car 2 blocks from the station and walked the rest of the way. The surveillance officers called Sergeant Crook to tell him they thought Cruz must be hiding something in his car. When Cruz arrived at the station, police asked if they could search his car. He told them the car was at his parents' in another county. They knew he was lying. They told him they knew where he parked it, and they didn't need his permission to search it. Reluctantly, he handed over the keys. Forensic investigators took pictures of the car from every angle, carefully recording what they saw before touching it. They moved in closer to gather more evidence, collecting and photographing virtually everything. It was too soon to tell what might be important later. The men worked in teams. Some officers inspected the evidence, while others marked where it was found. Investigators found blood stains on the sides and rear of the car. They marked the positions carefully. Later, the shape of the stains would be analyzed to calculate what direction the blood came from and its point of origin. These details are crucial for reconstructing a crime. Blood samples may also be collected for DNA analysis. Police searched the car inside and out. They looked through personal items in the back seat, hoping to find any piece of evidence to tie the victim to the car.
All right, it's 10:05. We're going into the trunk.
Next, they opened the trunk.
Oh, look at this right off the bat.
Inside, they found a gas can and other objects covered with blood.
Get a shot. One moment.
Beneath some clothing, they found several key pieces of evidence: a bloody tire iron and a .22 caliber rifle.
I'd say that's the deal.
The detectives now were almost certain Cruz killed Lynn Breeden, but they had no way of connecting the suspect to the victim. Cruz denied knowing her. He told friends he bought her identification on the black market, and police couldn't prove the blood on the car was hers. They needed to compare the DNA from the blood on the car to DNA from the victim. But where could they find the victim's DNA? They turned to David Sweet for help. He suggested looking for it in her impacted wisdom teeth. No one had ever tried it before, but it was their last hope.
We know theoretically that there are cells still embedded in the mineral tissues of the teeth, and we should be able to open the teeth, extract those cellular materials, and extract the DNA from the cells, and then process it in a forensic DNA analysis.
A tooth is an armor coating that surrounds a core of living tissue. Sweet hoped the tissue within the impacted wisdom teeth were protected from the fire by the thick jawbones surrounding them. He cut the first wisdom tooth from crown to root, but found no tissue inside. His second attempt was more successful. He found tissue, but he didn't know if its DNA was destroyed by the fire. He sent it to the lab to be tested. All he could do was wait. Did Chris Cruz kill Lynn Breeden? The answer was in a forensic lab in Vancouver, where the victim's tissue was sent for testing. Finally, Dr. Sweet received the results. The DNA survived the fire. What's more, further testing showed the DNA from the victim matched the DNA from the blood in Cruz's car. The lab calculated the odds that it wasn't the victim's blood were 1 in 540 million. Dr. Sweet proved that Lynn Breeden was in the car the night she died. Confronted with the overwhelming evidence, Chris Cruz confessed to murder. Based on interviews, detectives pieced together a likely scenario of that fatal night. Breeden once borrowed a great deal of money from Cruz. Now he wanted to collect. Breeden refused to pay him. Cruz lost his temper. Growing impatient, she got out of his car. Cruz beat her, shoved her body in the trunk, and drove to the dumpster. After he arrived at the secluded spot, the victim began to regain consciousness. Chris Cruz shot her. He thought the flames would erase all the evidence. How could he know the charge of murder would come from his victim's own mouth? Found guilty of second-degree murder, Chris Cruz received a life sentence. In rural Clay County, Alabama, a drive along Route 31 leads to a town caught between memories and progress, where turn-of-the-century storefronts share billing with a new city hall, where folks still get their news word of mouth, and where bad news and good news travel at about the same speed. Summertime slow. It's a safe place where parents don't think twice about giving their teenagers free rein to explore the land. A place where violence is an unwelcome stranger. On July 22, 1995, 3 riders on all-terrain vehicles discovered a burned mattress in the woods, and beneath it, what appeared to be blackened bones. They contacted Sheriff Ralph Toland, who responded to the call.
You think you've got a body? 3 miles. 3 miles east of 4977 intersection. Okay, we'll be on our way.
The men met the sheriff and led him to their grim discovery. It looked like murder. Toland began to secure the crime scene, but knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed to be sure no evidence was jeopardized.
I got down into the scene and I saw exactly what had happened. Saw the mattress charred and burned, nothing left but the springs over a skeleton. I just stopped everybody where they were at and told them to stop right there. Had them to go back out to the entrance from the road and ask them all just to secure it. I wanted forensic and the criminalist to come and help us collect all the evidence.
The man he wanted was Angelo Dellamana. A scientist with the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences, Dellamana never knows what he's going to find when he answers a call.
Whenever you get to a crime scene, you hope that it's been secure and cordoned off right after the discovery of the body. You don't want anybody into the crime scene that doesn't belong there. You don't want anybody messing up evidence. You want the evidence to be maintained in a secure fashion so that when you as a scientist get there to recover it, you can collect it without disturbing it, preserve it, bring it back to the laboratory, and do the tests that you need on it to find out who did the crime.
Dellamana marked the position of the body, the condition of the mattress and the surrounding area before he went to work collecting everything he could. Dellamana placed flags to mark the position of what little evidence he found. He marked 11 used cigarettes randomly scattered around the mattress. They hadn't been there long. That was a good sign. But who smoked them? The killer? The victim?
I felt it was going to be very hard not only to identify that person, but to generate some kind of evidence. I did feel at the crime scene that the cigarette butts present there were going to be very strong evidence because they did not look weathered. They were sitting up on top of the cushion of grass. I felt they had not been there very long.
As Dellamana assessed the situation, his technicians recorded the evidence. Since technicians don't want to leave part of themselves behind, they wear gloves. Dellamana's people had been trained so they don't unwittingly destroy the very clues that they're trying to save. If forensic scientists are careless in how they collect, store, or process evidence, they'll leave themselves vulnerable to attack in the courtroom. After the evidence was marked, photographed, and recorded, technicians carefully collected it. Bodies don't just turn up without someone missing them. Sheriff Toland already had a sinking suspicion about who the victim was. The week before, Jimmy Paris called him to report that his wife, Peggy Laughlin, was missing. Sheriff Toland decided it was time for his deputies to pay Paris a call.
You can't think of anywhere else she might have gone?
It was no secret around town that the couple had more than their share of knockdown, drag-out fights. No one would be surprised if Peggy just decided to up and leave. Meanwhile, the medical examiner compared the victim's backbone to spinal x-rays of Peggy Laughlin. They matched. Jimmy Paris became the prime suspect. But where was the evidence? Paris denied being anywhere near the woods that night. Dellamana tried to put the pieces together, but he didn't have enough of them to complete the picture. The forensics team turned up nothing at the crime scene. The cigarettes were the only clue untouched by the fire. The answer must lie with them. Detectives told him both Peggy and Jimmy smoked.
You can be looking at a case and feel going in that there isn't very much evidence there. The investigators don't think there's very much there to work with. But when you, as a forensic scientist, find that small piece of evidence, that one link that can either nail the suspect or clear a falsely accused individual, the rush that comes from that makes all the long hours worthwhile.
If he could lift DNA from the cigarette filters, he could compare it to the DNA of Paris and Laughlin. If he could prove they were together in the woods, Toland could make a case against Paris. Dellamana shined an ultraviolet light on the cigarettes. The light revealed the saliva-soaked areas. DNA can be obtained from saliva and lip cells. He marked the outline of the glowing portion he wanted to test. Then he carefully trimmed it away and sent it to the lab for DNA profiling.
To build a DNA profile, what we do first is we take our evidence sample, blood or saliva or whatever the DNA is in. Okay, what we do is we break open the cell and release the DNA. So we extract the DNA from whatever it's on. We clean it up and we look at specific areas or addresses on the DNA, and we make millions of copies of that area big enough so that we can see it. Once the DNA profile is done for each person in the case, we can then compare it to the evidence DNA profile and see if there's any matches there at all.
He was encouraged by the results. The lab identified DNA from 2 people, and 2 of the cigarettes held DNA from both people, meaning they shared their smokes. Could Delamana prove those 2 people were Jimmy Paris and Peggy Laughlin? Testing Paris's DNA was simple. Cooperating with police, he gave a blood sample, which provided ample DNA to analyze. But getting Laughlin's DNA proved much more difficult. Delamana had to try extracting it from her remains. He felt the best place to look for the DNA was in the marrow of the femur, or thigh bone. The largest bone in the body, it's the one most likely to have protected DNA from the fire. Bone marrow is rich in DNA. To expose as many cells as possible, Delamana ground it into a powder. He gave the powder to another scientist for DNA extraction. The scientist places the powder into a chemical bath that breaks open the cell's nuclei, releasing the DNA. Once the DNA is in the solution, bone fragments, chemicals, and impurities must be removed. The liquid goes through a series of microscopic filters. A centrifuge spins away the refuse. The filters trap the clean DNA. Theoretically, scientists can obtain DNA from just one cell. But to create a profile, they generally need thousands, though that number is decreasing. Not long ago, tests required a sample the size of a dime. Today, they can extract usable DNA from a drop of blood the size of a pinhead. The DNA is isolated. Now it's time to measure it. When the DNA is drawn through a membrane, it creates a band of color. By comparing the color, scientists can determine how much DNA they have. Delamana examines the results, which appear as small dark bands on a piece of film. DNA is measured in minuscule quantities called nanograms, or billionths of a gram. The test results tell Delamana whether he has enough DNA to work with.
Unfortunately, there's only about 0.3 nanograms of DNA in that sample. That's point and then 9 zeros and a 3 grams of DNA in that sample.
Delamana didn't have enough usable DNA for testing. But he had an ace up his sleeve, a scientific process so revolutionary, its inventor, Carrie B. Mullis, won the Nobel Prize. Up until 1993, scientists could test DNA only if they had large quantities. But bacteria, heat, and time take their toll, degrading DNA and leaving it in fragments. A process called PCR, or polymerase chain reaction, enables scientists to make multiple copies of DNA. DNA is made up of 4 chemical units: adenine, A, thymine, T, guanine, G, and cytosine, C. These units are strung together like beads. A joins only with T, and G joins only with C. PCR works by splitting apart the double-stranded DNA like a zipper. The thermocycler heats the DNA, separating the A from the T and the G from the C, essentially unzipping the helix down the center. More of these chemicals are added to the solution, and the two halves of the helix use them to make themselves whole. Repeat the process, and the two become four, and so on until millions of copies are created and the sample can be measured. When making a DNA profile, scientists don't need to compare the entire DNA molecule. They only look at several sites along the helix. If these sites are the same on both samples, the DNA most likely came from the same person. It's considered a match. Scientists used PCR to create enough DNA from the bone to do a profile. But the quantity and quality of the DNA was poor, so they could measure only one site. But in order to make a match, they needed to identify at least two sites. How could they find that second site? Delamana knew that a child's DNA is a combination of both parents' DNA. To solve Peggy Laughlin's murder, Delamana needed help from her brothers and sisters. If he could do their profiles, then he could work backward and calculate Peggy's.
Once we knew we didn't have enough DNA to build Peggy's complete DNA profile, we had to go and get a blood sample from every one of her brothers and sisters that were in the United States. These samples came from all over the United States.
As Delamana's investigation continued, Sheriff Toland received a call about an abandoned van found in a neighboring town. A license check showed it belonged to Jimmy Paris. Inside, forensic scientists found blood on the ceiling and walls. Part of the carpeting had been torn out.
I tell you what, Dan, above your head, right above your head.
Whoa, yeah.
You got three.
I see it.
Based on this evidence, they obtained a search warrant for Paris's home.
Hey, Jimmy. Hi. Sorry to bother you, John. You let us in to help us just fine. Stand aside there, back off with John. Found it.
Deputies searched the house for any clues that could link Paris to his wife's death. But they found nothing. Then an officer checked the crawl space and found a section of blood-soaked carpet. It matched the missing piece from Paris's van like a jigsaw puzzle. The possession of the carpet linked Paris to the bloodied van. Police had the murder scene, they had the victim, and they had their suspect. The evidence was strong enough to arrest Jimmy Paris for the murder of his wife. But to strengthen their case for conviction, police needed to link Paris, the van, and the burned mattress together. To do that, Paris had to be placed with the victim just before her death. Angelo Delamana was hard at work trying to accomplish just that. He was ready to make Peggy's DNA profile using the blood samples from her siblings.
We extracted them, put them through our full battery of DNA tests, and what we did was when we got the DNA profiles of the brothers and the sisters, we were able to work backwards and build the rest of Peggy's profile.
The genetic information Delamana gathered from the siblings enabled him to complete the missing link on Peggy's DNA. Peggy's DNA matched the DNA on the cigarettes. Here was proof that Peggy was alive with Jimmy in the woods the night she died. For forensics expert Paul Ferrara, the DNA match was the kind of evidence that tipped the scales against Jimmy Paris.
When looking at DNA evidence and the weight that you put on that DNA evidence, take that and place it in perspective with other evidence of motive, means, and opportunity. And when you combine all of those together, then one can come to an informed opinion that a person is guilty beyond reasonable doubt.
Harris had the motive, means, and opportunity to kill Peggy Laughlin. He was a jealous man, and he'd begun to suspect Peggy of infidelity. On that night, he invited her into the woods. He brought along a mattress, placing it on the ground and covering it with a blanket. Peggy and Jimmy smoked and talked, casually tossing aside the spent cigarettes. There, in the saliva and lip cells, lay the code of the murderer's identity, waiting to reveal its secret. Then, something happened that triggered a rage that drove Jimmy Paris to homicide.
The baby is crying too. You just leave the baby? No, I'm gonna go with the baby. You hear me?
Paris knew he had to destroy the body if he wanted to escape detection. Probably thought that if police couldn't find a body, they couldn't link him to the crime. He couldn't see that the evidence he had already left would be enough to convict him.
DNA analysis was crucial in the sense that it placed both the suspect and victim at the scene together. And in that case, having those small pieces of evidence allowed us to put a guilty man in prison and allow the family to put closure to a terrible incident.
In Alabama and Vancouver, scientists struggled to find DNA evidence to link a killer to his victim. But the power of DNA is not just its ability to put people behind bars. It also holds the key to setting them free. Attorney Barry Scheck, part of O.J. Simpson's criminal defense team, doesn't believe everyone behind bars is guilty. Using DNA, he's making a strong case. Scheck heads the Innocence Project, a program at the Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law in New York. The program is dedicated to exonerating the innocent through DNA profiling.
Geological Institute, and that they had actually responded, we have something but not enough to test.
Scheck provides the expertise. The students do the legwork, sifting through hundreds of cases, looking for those with the most promise. Once cases are identified, the students investigate whether the evidence still exists. If it does, they see if it can be used for DNA testing.
I don't know. There's nothing in the red well 2 yet.
It became clear to us that DNA had the power to go back into old cases, re-examine it, and exonerate people that had been convicted many years ago, that lots of people felt might be innocent.
The Innocence Project helped exonerate 30 of the 40 people released through DNA since the project began in 1992. Today, startling FBI statistics show that 1/4 to 1/3 of all DNA testing at its lab clears a suspect. No one knows how many innocent people remain in prison across the United States. but the Innocence Project is doing its best to find them.
Now we have all these cases of people who have been convicted who can credibly come forward and say, look, I didn't commit this crime. There was serological evidence that was introduced against me. There was hair evidence that was introduced against me, for example. Please test items in my case. It'll prove me innocent. And that's happening in case after case after case.
What were the circumstances of the identification?
Louise Hochberg is the executive director of the Innocence Project. In 1993, a convict named Troy Webb appealed to her colleagues for help. He trusted DNA to prove he was innocent of rape.
Troy Webb first wrote to us in 1993, and I understand from Troy that the way he got to us was through his cellmate, who apparently was also a client of the Innocence Project.
Webb was arrested in 1988 after a rape victim picked him out of a photo lineup. Eyewitness identification has led to most convictions where defendants were later proved innocent through DNA profiling. Hochberg believed in Webb's innocence, but it would be 3 years before she and her students returned him to his family in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
The principal criteria for us is, number one, can this person make a credible claim of innocence? And number two, the most important, is there biological evidence in the case that we can test, which combined with other factors will be determinative, will prove that this person did not commit the crime for which he or she was convicted.
The Innocence Project had evidence in the case sent to Paul Ferrara's forensic lab in Richmond. There, scientists compared DNA from evidence left at the rape scene to DNA in a blood sample from Troy Webb.
The level of the technology, even 10 years ago, was such that we couldn't eliminate Troy Webb, for example, as the possible contributor of the genetic material. But by the same token, we wouldn't have been able to eliminate a large percent of the population.
Before they could start the testing process, the lab had to retrieve genetic material from evidence stored 7 years earlier. Once it was identified, they had to see if it contained viable DNA. They used an acid test to confirm the biological fluid was present. If the fluid is present, the indicator liquid turns purple. Another method is to use a light source, called an omnichrome, that makes fluids glow. If the scientist is looking for blood to test for DNA, she'll use a chemical called luminol to find it. Luminol can detect the faintest trace of blood, making it especially helpful in instances where blood may have been washed away by rain or where a killer has tried to remove it. In Troy Webb's case, investigators swabbed the evidence from the victim's clothing. The sample would contain the perpetrator's DNA. They'll compare it with Troy's DNA. Comparing DNA is a matter of comparing the lengths of strands of genetic code at specific points on the double helix. Scientists place the DNA sections they want to compare into a gel. The DNA has a negative charge, so scientists can use a positive charge to pull it through the gel. The longer pieces travel more slowly than the shorter pieces. So two pieces of the same length would move the same distance. If the DNA from the evidence and the suspect move the same distance across the gel, scientists know they're the same length and they have a match. If the segments don't move the same distance, they couldn't belong to the same person. The segment lengths can be seen and measured under lights that make the DNA fluoresce. These are the printouts of the actual DNA profiles in the Troy Webb case. They fade with time so scientists take photographs for a permanent record. Scientists needed to compare only one site on Troy Webb's DNA strand to the DNA from the evidence. If it didn't match, he couldn't have committed the crime.
4.2, 4.3, and the corresponding pattern.
Besides comparing Webb's DNA to the evidence, it's also compared to the DNA of the victim and the rapist. The dot patterns make the differences between the DNA perfectly clear. None of the DNA matches the DNA from the evidence.
This DNA type did not come from Troy Webb, and the true rapist in this case is actually still at large right now.
On September 7th, 1996, the Innocence Project released the results. In Virginia, where new evidence may not be presented more than 21 days after sentencing, the only option was clemency. The governor reviewed the petition and granted the pardon.
There is no greater good that a lawyer can do, in my judgment, than to look back at old cases, and if it can be demonstrated that an injustice was done, to right it.
On October 16, 1996, Troy Webb emerged from prison a free man. The first thing he wanted to do was eat a 7-foot sub from Philadelphia Cold Cuts. He now works at the sub shop. He's made new friends and reestablished a bond with family. He lives with the same faith and hope that kept him going in prison, and he's grateful to the Innocence Project.
They're like family, really, you know, because wasn't for them, I'd probably still be locked up, you know. But they helped me, you know, for free at that, you know. So, couldn't ask for too much more.
All hope is not lost of catching the real rapist. Virginia has amassed the largest database of DNA in the country by collecting blood samples from every convicted felon.
20,000 a year.
Tens of thousands of blood samples pour in every year, creating a backlog of more than 135,000 samples in cold storage. Still, of the nearly 10,000 DNA profiles in the databank, Virginia has already solved 18 crimes by matching DNA from the crime scene. If the DNA from the case can be matched with DNA in the databank, the rapist will be found.
Our DNA databank here was one of the early ones created. I think we had one hit in 1993, none in 1994, and then 5 in 1995, then 12 in 1996 alone. And the database, even in 1996, only numbered less than 9,000 profiles out of those 130,000 samples we have. When we get to the point where we have the convicted felon profiles, all 130,000 of them, the number of these hits is going to skyrocket dramatically until the point at which they are commonplace. If you are innocent of a crime, DNA technology is your best friend, your best ally. But conversely, if you're guilty, it's your worst enemy.
DNA profiling holds tremendous power for a technology still in its infancy. In its first 10 years, the diminutive double helix has quickly become one of the new detective's biggest allies, bringing criminals to justice and delivering justice to the innocent.